So we're in the Maamar of Matza of the previous Rebbe, 1944. We're on page 222, 3 lines from the bottom. I mentioned yesterday that the previous Rebbe here introduces a teaching from his great-grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek. Parenthetically, something hit me about 3 weeks ago, which I put into a footnote in the upcoming book. Tzemach Tzedek's father's name was Rav Sholem Shachne Altschuler. And Tzemach Tzedek married the Mittel Rebbe's daughter, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe's daughter. What should have been the Tzemach Tzedek's name? Rebbe Nachum Mendel Altschuler. What did he call himself? Rebbe Nachum Mendel Schneerson. Anyone have an explanation? No one had an explanation. No one knows. But, all these years, here I am, so many years immersed in Chabad teachings and history, and it just dawned on me, and when I asked a few people who are knowledgeable, they didn't even think about it. So I'm just mentioning, since I mentioned it, Tzemach Tzedek, it's interesting. Now, it's not a question, and it is a question, because in those days people took different names. The whole saga of family names became relevant during the period of the Tzemach Tzedek's years as Rebbe, 1840, 50, 60, I don't know exactly what year. For example, the Mittler Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, was called Rabbi Dov Ber Shnei Ori, because his father's first name was Shneir Zalman.
But what was the Alter Rebbe's last name though? Wasn't he?
He was called Reb Shneir Zalman Baruchovich because his father's name was Baruch. It was before Russia gave family. It was before that period. Both. Right? It was during the Tzemach Tzedek. I don't have the exact date, but this is public knowledge. You could look it up, I'm sure, and find out when the Tsar instituted family names. I believe it was sometime in 1830, 40, 50, sometime then. And he chose the name Schneerson. Now, we do know that because of what the Alter Rebbe went through and the Mittler Rebbe, both, they had a very good name in the governmental offices. And so it's logical, it makes sense that he would choose a more prominent name that was known in Russia, Schneerson versus Altschuler. And because the Tzemach Tzedek, like his predecessors and successors, wanted to and did help Jewish people throughout Russia and the region by opening factories, giving people parnasa. People think that Lubavitcher Rebbes were just sitting at home and writing Maamarim and teaching Hasidus and giving Yechidus. It's a big mistake, a very big mistake. Specifically, the Lubavitcher Rebbes from the Alter Rebbe through our Rebbe were very much involved in helping Yidden throughout those areas. For example, the land of Dennenberg, I forget now, certain sections were actually given to the Tzemach Tzedek to open agriculture opportunities for Yidden, and he did that. And you're talking now, and thousands of Jews had parnasa for many years later because of that. And why did he get it? Who was he? Because he was a Schneerson. There's an expression in Russian that they would call Rabbiner something, rabbi of notoriety. So it makes sense to me that he chose the name, Schneerson, versus his own father's family name, Altschuler, because of the prominence that the Schneerson name had in Russia. But again, I haven't seen it documented. Yes, Moshe.
Tzedek, in those days, in the Tzemach Tzedek, did he himself gravitate on his own to the I want to call it the Chabad Hasidus, but in those days it wasn't exactly called probably Chabad Hasidus yet. But did he come from already? Was his father already somehow connected to the Mittler Rebbe?
Oh, so first of all, it's incorrect. At that time, Chabad Hasidus was known and called Chabad Hasidus and Hasidim.
Okay.
And actually, it goes back. The name Chabad goes back to the Alter Rebbe's time. There's the academics and others have a disagreement what particular year we could point to as the founding of the Chabad movement, because the Alter Rebbe, was appointed by Reb Mendel of Vitebsk and Reb Avram of Kalisk when they left in 1788 to Eretz Yisrael. So he was appointed as a Rebbe for that entire region, which was called then White Russia, right? And he wasn't appointed as a Chabad Rebbe, he was appointed as a Hasidic Rebbe. He replaced them, and they were appointed by the Maggid, right? So now the question is when, but yet, we see with the story with Rebbe Shlomo Karliner, who wanted to come in. He was being, pursued and bothered by the Misnagdim, so he had to get out of town, right? From Lita, from Karlin, which is in the Lita region, and he asked permission of the Alter Rebbe, who was the one in charge of Rysen. The area was called Rysen, White Russia, whether he can park himself there. You needed permission. Things were organized because Reb Avram Kalisker and Reb Mendel Vitebsk said that, and everyone knew he is the one in charge. So if you want to come into his territory, you need permission. And he asked. And the Alter Rebbe told him 3 conditions, 2 of which he was agreeable, but the 3rd he wasn't, which was that he wanted to teach Hasidus in the style of Polish Hasidus, and meaning also tzaddik bemunosa yichya, you rely on the tzaddik. And the Alter Rebbe said, in this area we don't follow that approach. We use Chabad. Well, that tells us an interesting point. That the Alter Rebbe, although officially not being called the Chabad Rebbe at that time, was seemingly teaching the people and that this approach of Tzaddik B'Mnasa Yichya is not the approach that I want for this region. So some say that points to the fact that that's when Chabad started, even though it wasn't officially called Chabad Hasidim. Okay, and others argue, although that's true, it doesn't still mean that the Chabad ethos was the only way to learn Hasidus and etc. But one thing's for sure, what I said now is during the Alter Rebbe's times, but during the Tzemach Tzedek's times, it was definitely Chabad. I mean, let's go 10 years later. I was talking about 1788, 1780s. In 1798, 1799, Rav Avram Kalisker, who lived at the time in Tveria, he opposed the Alter Rebbe's style of Chabad, and he sent Reb Nachman of Breslov 450 miles out of his way upon his return from Eretz Yisrael to the Alter Rebbe to try to convince him not to teach Chabad. That's in 1800. In 1800. So you're talking about, so there's no question that from 1788, 1790 to 1800, sometime during that time is when Chabad became known as Chabad Hasidus. There is a sefer that Rabbi Nochem Greenwald wrote, a very large 500-page sefer on, it's called Rav. Rav, it's in Hebrew. And he has a lot of discussion about what I'm telling you, so I'm sharing some of that.
Okay, but the Tzemach Tzedek, okay, thank you for that.
Oh, so that was one point that I wanted to correct in your statement.
Okay.
The second point is an interesting question. I don't have an answer. I don't remember. I think that if Sholem Shach, the Altshuler, was already connected to the Alter Rebbe as a Chabad Chassid. I think. So he started his connection before the Mittler Rebbe.
Isn't one of the isn't there another Shalom Shachna who married one of the daughters of the Mittler Rebbe?
Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. No, Shalom Shachta married the daughter of the Mittler Rebbe.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I don't know if this is interesting to Hillel and Yonason.
Yeah, okay. He wasn't from Regina, like Regina.
No. I know what you're talking about. No.
Okay.
I know what you're talking about. You're talking about a son or grandson of the Maggid who was associated with the Regina, right? His name was Dobritcher. Forget now. I think I know what you're talking about. No, that's different.
No, okay. This was okay. Altshuler.
Altshuler,
okay.
and who he was named after, where he came from, I don't know, but it's known. It can be. I believe it's been written about. I just never spent time on that. Okay, but so since we're going to learn now from the Tzemach Tzedek Sefer Achkira regarding Hashem's Koyach HaBilti Bal Gvul that we learned yesterday, and Hillel commented nicely on it, that there's a difference between something that begins deteriorating from creation versus something that is not that way, and only at the time when Hashem says, now I want it to begin deteriorate, it begins deteriorating. That's the Nekuda that we learned yesterday. And now, Yonasim, the Rebbe brings another raya from Sefer Achkira. Let's see what he says. Let's look at the constellations. There are many different bodies. Each one's different. The sun goes one direction, the moon another direction, the stars a third direction. Each one has what we call Hillel, a hiluch miyuchad, a specific path. This path, Yonason, is different than its friend, the other. He calls mechaveiroi, like they're friends and buddies,
We're talking like about an orbit, a planetal orbit
yes,
kind of idea?
I think so. Let's see it, but I think so. They are all with the same objective. Eis hayoim v'halayla v'koir, the time of day, night, winter, cold, hot, kayetz, summer, v'choir of winter, zera v'kotzir, planting and reaping. In other words, they all have one mechuvan, one objective, to accomplish day, night, cold, hot. In other words, although they're different, they all work in unison to create the atmosphere, the temperature, the distinction between night and day. It all comes together. It's wonderful. Bekavona achas, with one mechuvan, one objective. Im Kain, back to the text. Mihu hamekashram. Who brings them together, asks the Tzemach Tzedek. If they are mechulakim, gufi mechulakim, separate entities, separate bodies, Who brings them together to have one objective program? Who brings them together and kind of forces them, work together, guys. Don't get into a fight. Sun, don't interrupt the moon, and moon, don't interrupt the sun. Al korchach einay hanefesh v'koyach shebetoich kol galgal. The Tzemach Tzedek says, and the Rebbe quotes it here, the Rebbe, it's not the particular soul and drive within each constellation. Why? The particular soul and koyach and power within every constellation, the whole koyach of it in each star, it is only able to move based on this particular constellation's orbit. And it would not be able to do something that is contrary to its modus operandi. It would not be able to bind itself and join itself to the other Galgil, the other constellation. And it would not lend itself to an organized orbit, one in which it guards itself, it guards Sivuvai, its orbit, from touching and interfering the other's orbit. And that it remain diligent where it is, the place that's been designated for it, that it should be constantly designated to what Hashem wants of it on earth, in the universe. And every one of them individually does its job all together constantly. It cannot be, the Rebbe says, that its individual orbit would not get in the way of the other's orbit. I would think the logic is, I don't know if he says it, he doesn't. Why? Because since it's limited, it has its agenda. If it has its agenda, it says, I don't like the other's agenda, right? Do it my way or the highway. And yet we see no interference. Things work out exactly correctly, because there's some greater koyach that makes them come together. That's the point. Let's continue. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, we cannot say that what binds them and what unites them is something called the supernal Galgal, which is called Galgal Hayomi, the constellation, the day constellation, Shekol HaGalgalim Kvuyim Boy, that all of the Galgalim are set, are in it. If we were to argue that, we could say Shenefesh HaGalgal Hazeh, that the soul of this Galgal Elyon, Hu HaMesavavam, it makes them orbit, Kulam Ki Ish Echad, like one man, Al Kavon Achas, with one objective. Says that Tzemach Tzedek Al Be'emes Yev Shaloi Makei. Truthfully, he says we can't say that. True. All Galgalim, all constellations orbit because of the general Galgal Ayomi. I don't know what that is. Hillel, do you know what this general Galgal Ayomi is that he's referring to?
I think that like the daily circulation, the Earth's rotation on its axis. That's what I would imagine.
You understand? What do you say?
Yeah, I think it's talking about the sun.
The sun?
Yeah.
Okay. So 1 second. So the Rebbe says, Tzedek says, that it's true. He says, it's true, there is a Galgal Yoimi, whether it's what Hillel said or what Yonis said or both together, whatever. Mikol Moken, nevertheless, Einom Adukim Udvukim Boy. All the Galgalim are not Aduk. You know what Aduk means? Attached, connected, Aduk. Udvukim, from the word Dvekus. K'mayevari ha'adam, similarly to limbs of a man, ba'adam she'ayivarim kulam dvukim boy, all limbs are connected and attached to man, v'kulam yachadim gufechad, and all together, all the limbs make one body. So the Rebbe says, it's not similar to limbs. Lo she'ayivarim kol echad v'echad guf b'fnei atzmai. Why? Because Moshe, by the limbs, each limb is not an independent body. Each limb is part of one body. And that's the difference between the limbs of man and the Galgalim and the constellations. The constellations, every Galgal is an independent guf. So therefore the Rebbe says, we cannot say that just as the limbs of one's body, the various limbs, are all controlled by one body, he says, it would not make sense to say that here because every single Galgal has its own body. And since it has its own body, it's independent. And if it's independent, why should it be together? Why should it listen and follow order and cohesiveness? Yes, Yonason. You want to say something, Yonason? Go ahead.
Yeah, there are nine or eight planets around the solar system, and they each go around according to their own orbit, according to their own speed, and they don't interfere with each other, and they are completely independent of each other, and it's quite amazing the way they do that.
Have you studied Yonason astronomy?
Yeah, I've studied it. Not in detail, but I studied it.
Very nice. Good. I'm glad. So, thank you for sharing that. So let's see what the Rebbe says further. There is one limb is one part of a body, and that limb is attached and connected to the other limbs. Conversely, avo galgalim einoi kain. The constellations are not so. Kiyim, rather, like Yonason said, kol echad v'echad guf b'fnei atzmai. Every single galgal has its own independent guf. The proof to this is masha hagalgalim mechulakim zeh mizeh b'zivuvam. It says, you see that in their orbit, they're all very different. Yonason, could you comment on that? What does that mean, that in their orbit, they're all very different?
Yeah, they go at a different speed around the sun, and because one is small and the other one is big, Jupiter and Saturn are huge compared to Earth and Mars and Venus, so they go around at a different speed. And but the orbits never interfere with each other.
So that's what it means. The proof is the fact that the Galgalim are different in their orbit, but as we say, they don't interfere. Moshe, you ready? He quotes now the Rambam. Galgalim Saivivim Barav Lemizrach. The constellations orbit from west to east. Umehem Saivivim, and there are some that orbit Mimizrach Lemaida from east to west. At Kan L'Shoinoi. Here ends the language of the Rambam. Uve Sefer Nechmad V'Noyim Shar Al Aleph Simentes. He writes in that Sefer Sheroi Bashiva Koichvei Leches B'Chol Echad Mehem, that we see regarding the seven. What's the translation of Koichvei Leches?
Ellipses, cycles.
No. It's the word trajectory.
The trajectory?
No.
Orbit, I think, is the best word.
Okay. Ba'ashiva koich v'leches.
What?
Yes.
Is this sefer that he mentions Nechma? Sefer Nechmad Benaim?
I have no idea.
The sefer of the Rambam? Okay.
I don't know what you've heard before of this of the sefer?
No, I'm asking.
I never heard. I don't know. I don't know, but it looks like it's a sefer that explains the Galgalim and things like that. Maybe we can do a Google later, Anyway. Shero b'ashiva koich v'leches b'chol echad behem mahalach yedua muchlav Nazi. That we see in the orbit and the trajectory of each of these 7 that they have a particular path, and umuchlat b'fnei atzmai. It's designated for each to their own. Mahalach she'eino doim lemahalach haveiroi. And he says this trajectory, Moshe, of each of these 7 stars kind of is different than the other. V'im kain, if so, you can't say, he says, that it's one body. Remember, this is the difference he's making between the limbs of a man in one body versus each of the Galgalim, which has its own body. Because it has a different trajectory. That's what he says. Mahalach she'eino doime lemahalach haveiroi. And its mahalach, its approach, its trajectory, its orbit is not similar to the other one. V'im kain, therefore there can't be one guf. V'im kain, ech yisayv k'tzosoi kach, because if you were to say they're all part of one guf, how could you say some will orbit this a little bit this way, and some will orbit a little bit that way, going in different directions? If this one's orbiting from east to west, then the other one might have it makes no sense if it's the same thing. That proves that it's not the same thing, that each one has its own guf and its own approach. And the sun, or whatever, the Galgal HaYomi, it orbits from east to west. Ushara Galgalim, Ruba Mimasavim Sibuv Atzmon. And most other Galgalim orbit within themselves, kind of, or Mimarav LeMizrach, from west to east. Rebbe says a very philosophical rule. It is impossible to have one guf have two opposing forces to be experienced at once. Make up your mind: right to left, left to right, east to west, west to east. Which way are you going? It's a two-way street. You can't do both at the same time. This all points to the fact. Yes, Moshe.
Except for that example you gave us, I forgot the name of the chassid, that he cried out of one eye and he smiled out of the other eye.
Reperetz of Chernigov, a.k.a. Reperetz Chaim. There's a Chabad family Chaim. Reperetz of Chernigov. He was, Hasidim would say, they would see tears from one eye and smiling from the other eye. But, they looked at him as not normal. How could that be? But he was very normal, but he was on a very high level. But here we're talking about Begashmias in the world of the constellations. Ela behechrech, sheim gufim muvdolim zeh mizeh. We must conclude that they are different, separate bodies. Uvehechrech loimish yesh koyach echad elyon. And we also must say, and this is the point, the punchline that the Frierdiker Rebbe wants to explain, that there's a higher force that's greater than the force within the constellations and the heavenly hosts. V'hu bilti bal gvul. That force is limitless. V'hu ha'mekashram u'mechabram yachad l'kavon achas. Now, if science agrees or doesn't, I don't know how science would explain this, but the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rambam and Torah believes that there is this force, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Eibishter is the force that brings everyone together. So if you look at it from a Teva perspective, from each body's celestial bodies, DNA, they couldn't live together. And this is why I mentioned yesterday why we had a problem with the Tiferes Yisrael when he says Boina Olam Zu Machrivan. He created worlds and they destroyed each other. You're right. If you only look at and understand Hashem as being Koyach HaGvul, a power of finite, there's going to be destruction because everyone gets in the way of the other one. And they can't live together, can't orbit together. But here you see that it's not that way. The sun comes out and the moon goes to sleep. The moon comes out, the sun goes. Who tells it? Who tells it? What is it in each of these entities that makes them go aside so peacefully and calmly and in a harmonious way for the other? The answer is the koyach habilti bal gvul. Yes, Yonason.
The Rambam says that each planet has a nefesh and a guf.
Yes.
And the nefesh of the planet is connected to the grace and the summer, which is Hashem.
Yes, but if I understand what's being said here is that the nefesh of that planet is still gvul.
Yes, it is gvul.
It is.
But it connects to the portal to the higher power.
Oh, okay. Right. Good. So at the end of the day, it's the higher force and power, the bilti bal gvul, that makes it behave itself. Let's learn the Kitzer. Yevayir explains, a logic and comprehension and a meditation that's specific for the third midah called beauty, charisma. V'hu gedulos Hashem. This is the greatness, meditating on the greatness of God, that it creates and sustains infinite worlds that are created and infinite. He also mentioned Hashemayim Mesaper and Kuvaydel. When we look at the heaven, we see the glory of God. Mitzvah Hashemayim, on the Yodim. From the heavenly hosts, we know that God has an infinite power. Tzva Haaretz Kayom B'min. Earthly hosts exist b'min, meaning not just in the kind, right? That's why the kind can die. But tzva shamayim, heavenly hosts, the constellations and everything else is kayom mi'ish. They exist of species. V'yasbir, and he explained al galgalim gufim u'cholokim, that the constellations have individual bodies. Each one has a specific trajectory. And nevertheless, each one goes towards the overall objective. And that overall objective cannot happen if it were to only be from the perspective of the soul of the Galgal, Yonason. And even not even based on the overall Galgal, whether you call the sun or whatever, Galgal Yomi. Ella, it comes Mikoyach Elyon Habli Gvul. Now, I wouldn't be surprised that not everyone agrees with this amongst the Jewish philosophers. I simply don't know enough. We would have to know what the Rasag and Saadia Gaon says. I would think that this is open for a lot of discussion in the writings of Jewish philosophers like the Rambam, the Rasag. This is part of Hakira, Jewish philosophy. Okay.
Well, meaning, what, Rabbi Dalvin, what would you think would be a counter argument?
A counter argument would be, for example, that the Galgal Yomi, the overall Galgal, is powerful enough to keep things peaceful and together. Now, we have three things here. What we learned now is three things. There is the Galgal Prati, there is the specific individual Galgal, right? The moon, the sun, right? Each of the planets, etc. Then there is a general Galgal, which is called Galgal Yomi. Yonason says that's a reference to the sun. I don't know enough to say what it is, but whatever that is. And then there is something, he says, a force that's beyond the Galgal Yomi. So I see three things here. I don't know how the other philosophers see it. I just don't know enough. You need to... What? Go ahead.
Let me ask you a question. I was going to ask...
I was just going to comment that it seems to me that what this is an argument is kind of the whole fundamental philosophical question. Did Hashem set the universe in motion and, kind of let it run by natural law, or is there hashgacha pratius? And this is a, very robust hashgacha pratius argument.
Okay, I could see that. Yeah, I could see your point. Based on what the Rebbe is saying, I could see that. Moshe, what are you saying?
Well, I was going to ask something slightly different. I mean, we're talking about astronomy here. And one of the things that I seem to remember coming across, and I never confirmed this, but is it possible that the Rebbe held that the Earth, this is going to sound very bizarre, maybe, but is it possible that the Rebbe held that the Earth, that the sun...
The sun revolved around the Earth?
Yes.
It's a Gemara. Go ahead.
Has anybody? I mean, have any of you ever heard that the Rebbe held this way?
Well, I do know that the Rebbe, there's in one of the books I've read, he describes defends that idea or promotes that idea that the sun revolves around the Earth from the perspective of, when you have bodies in motion, depending on where your perspective, that's you can view it from that way. I have seen that. I think that there's a discussion of that in the Gutnick Chumash.
It begins with a Gemara. Before the Rebbe, 2,000 years before, there is a Gemara. And what does the Gemara say? You know that the Gemara speaks about this, right? I think it's in Baba Basra. Yeah, what is the Gemara's...
I mean, the Gemara's perspective is that the sun revolves around the earth.
Thank you. So Moshe, it begins with a Gemara. The Rebbe and others grapple with that, and how do you explain that? But it's a Gemara.
And is there any definitive... is there anything that definitive that says, or do we know how the Rebbe held definitively, or?
There's numerous letters that are published on this, and talks that have been given by Chabad-oriented scientists. I cannot talk intelligently about this. I tried over the years as a younger man. You have to know science. You have to really know, and I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I just couldn't. So I can't answer that definitively. I can't tell you, but that the Gemara says that is definite. Okay. But take out. You must have at home some of these books, Science and Torah, and see what they say. And I know that there are disagreements amongst the Orthodox scientists on this issue. And I think that many of them, or some of them, did not accept the Rebbe's arguments. So this was, discussed, and there was or maybe is an organization called Orthodox Scientists. You ever hear of that organization? It started here in New York years ago. The 50s and 60s, this was a very big topic. And they naturally discussed things with the Rebbe because he was so studied in addition to knowing Torah, so he was a man who can deal with it. Moshe Feinstein, that wasn't his field, or a Baron Cutler, that wasn't their field. I'm talking about someone who studied the sciences and knew it. Rabbi Soloveitchik was, the Rebbe was, so there are letters from the Rebbe to the Orthodox scientists and back and forth, and they had Yechidus in. So this, you're identifying, Moshe, a part of history that was dealt with, but I cannot say in good faith. I can say definitively there is a book when I was a bacher. I remember reading and trying to understand it called Emunah. How do you say science? Mada and Emunah, something that they collected all of the Rebbe's scientific letters in one place. And, in English, it's in Or HaTorah Journal from Professor Branover. And maybe it's online today. Maybe you can find this online. There was a lot of discussion about this. Okay. I have to go to another shir. We'll see everyone tomorrow. We will learn. I'll let you know. Bring the letter. The letter. Let's start learning the letter from 1934. I assume you still have it on your computers. Right, that we learned from Purim. There's a section there from Pesach. Yeah. Okay, Zaydas and everyone. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.